morning, seventh grade. I am coming to you from Stony Brook State Park. Not really. I've been playing with my virtual backgrounds. You may have noticed some of the other ones in the past. I was going to share this one with one last week, but I had to delete that video. So I wanted to share with you, I hope that you're getting outside and enjoying nature. This particular picture is from a camping trip we took a couple of years ago when we went camping at Stony Brook with their beautiful waterfalls. And we did hike, and I will show you real quick when I move out of the way. There I am with my family climbing up some of those stairs. So that was about 2 years ago, and I can't wait. I hope we get to go camping this year. Today, our lesson is to continue reading Across 5 Aprils by Irene Hunt, and we are going to read chapter 4 today. But first, let's take a look at the questions that we have that go along with chapter 4, and hopefully you have those handy that you can take notes while we're reading. So chapter 4, we have 7 questions. You're going to submit chapters 3 and 4 together for me. Question 1, at what point did the Union begin to win more battles? And remember, last chapter, the South was winning almost everything. So there is a point where it starts to turn around a little. Question 2, why did Ellen give the letter to Jethro? 3, what did Tom's letter say? 4, why was Jenny upset about the war? 5, why did Jethro go to Shad's house? 6, how did Shad make Jethro understand the war? And 7, what were Jethro's thoughts as he fell asleep? All right, so let's take a look at the book. Hopefully by this point you do have your book at home. I believe it should have been delivered, but since I still have access to the online version, we're going to take a look through it here as well. So you can either follow along on the screen or follow along in your own book on page 47. Chapter 4. Twice during the month of February in 1862, the bells rang in every city and town throughout the North, and the name Ulysses S. Grant first became familiar to Jethro. I'm hoping that name is familiar to you as well. We'll talk about him more later on, but he's a pretty important name in this book. The first real victory for the North had come with the fall of Fort Henry down in Tennessee, just a few miles south of the Kentucky line. So let's pause for a second. Let's go to our map that we have been looking at. I know it's not the most beautiful map here, but I am going to mark it as red because it is a red state, but it is going to be a win for the North, and Tennessee is this state right below Kentucky here. And as far as exactly where it is, it's pretty close to this little river, I believe, that it's marking, and right on close on the border. So I'm not exactly in the right spot. It's kind of tricky to mark it on here, but it's pretty close there. And that would actually be, maybe what I should do is make that a blue dot, because it is a win for the North, and usually the Union will be outlined in blue. All right, so now that we have an idea where it is compared to Illinois and where our characters are. All right. God bless Grant, people shouted over and over in a rising chant the day Jethro went to Newton with his father after the news of Fort Henry. Guns were fired and people hugged one another in the streets. Here was something to make them proud, something to give them hope after the despairing stories of Bull Run and Ball's Bluff and Wilson's Creek. 2 weeks later came the news that Fort Donelson had also fallen to Grant, so same general, and they've won again. Then people really went wild with joy. So that question was when? You can see right in the beginning, February 1862. God bless old U.S. Grant. So I just want to point out his name was Ulysses S. Grant, but yet when you abbreviate that, we have U.S. like United States. So it was quite catchy. They shrieked, bless old unconditional surrender Grant. So another nickname with the U, unconditional, meaning he will not surrender. Okay. They laughed and cried, and nearly everybody thought that the war would be over in a matter of weeks. What do you think, Pa? Jenny asked eagerly a few days later as she put down the paper she had been reading aloud to the family. Do you think it's about to be over? Matt's face was grim. With the Army of the Potomac doing nothing? He asked. Maybe my wits ain't good. Maybe I ain't got the sense to grasp what it is they're doing, but I can't see the end in sight. That general the papers had us believe was so fine, brilliant they called him. What does he plan? What's the matter with him? General McClellan has had typhoid fever, Pa. You know how weak that left Shad. We mustn't judge him too harsh. So I want to point out that there are different units in the Army that are fighting in different places. So General Grant has one particular unit down in Tennessee. Army of the Potomac, keep in mind, would be, that's where they're from, which is near, is in Virginia and Washington, D.C. area. General McClellan, who was mentioned in the last chapter, is in charge of the Army of the Potomac. And they will be pretty important because some of the brothers will end up fighting for him later on. But Pa's wondering, what are they doing? You know, it's not just one particular unit that's going to win the war. It's all of them. Matt nodded. Maybe I misjudged the man, Jenny. God knows, I hope that one of these days you can say that your pa was wrong about General McClellan. He reached for the week-old paper and read again the letter that was the great tonic and stimulant of the day. So bringing everybody's spirits up. Headquarters, Army in the field. Camp near Fort Donelson, February 16th. General S.B. Buckner, Confederate Army. That's who it's going to. Sir, yours of this date proposing armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation is just received. So they're asking for capitulation, that is conditional surrender. An immediate surrender can be accepted. Oh, I'm sorry. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. I am, sir, very respectfully yours, observant servant, U.S. Grant, Brigadier General. So point out that General Buckner sent in terms for capitulation, meaning they're willing to surrender, but under certain conditions. But General Grant says, nope, no conditions, unconditional surrender, which is part of where his nickname comes from. Matt read on farther down the page. It says here that this General Buckner and Grant was comrades at West Point, he remarked, without lifting his eyes from the paper. Yes, Jethro heard his mother say softly to herself, and my Bill and Tom was even closer than that. I think that's a typo. I think it's supposed to say Bill and John, because those were the ones that were so close. They were worried about Tom and Eb. It was likely that the two boys were with Grant's army. The fighting, especially at Donelson, had been bitter. Some of the details of the battle neither Matt nor Jenny had read aloud to Ellen. Finally, one day, Ed Turner brought them a letter from Tom. Ed looked pinched with cold after his long drive, but he wouldn't stop for coffee. A family needs to be alone when one of these letters comes, he said in answer to Ellen's invitation. I'd be pleased if you'd let me know what the boy has to say later on when Matt has time to drop over. Jenny had gone with her father to see about some stock, and Jethro was alone in the cabin with his mother. When Ed Turner was gone, she handed the letter to Jethro. My hands is shaken, son, she said. They were indeed, but both she and the boy knew that the real reason she was forced to hand the letter over was the fact that she could not read. So quite often some of us will misconstrue that answer. Why is it that she hands the letter over to Jethro? Is it because her hands are shaking? No, the real reason is because she can't read. Okay. The envelope was crumpled and stained, the letter written in pencil in a round, childish hand. It was probably among the first 3 or 4 letters that young Tom had ever written. Now, there have been years that I have given this letter as a grammar exercise where you've got to go through and fix all the spelling and the grammar mistakes. So not only can Ellen not read, but we're going to see that at the time period that Tom particularly struggles with some of his writing and grammar skills. It wasn't really a priority back then. So we see, dear folks, I take pencil in hand to let you know that Eb and me is all right. So hopefully you see all those spelling mistakes. I expect you know by now how we took Fort Henry down here. Maybe I oughtn't say we took it because it was the ironclads that done it. So that was a vocab word last week. So it wasn't really the Army that did it. I mentioned it was right on the river there. So those, the ships with the ironclad ships are really the ones that won the battle. Old Admiral Foote had what it took, and he gave the Rebs a dressing down, but had some of his ironclads got hit hard. A boy I know was on the Essex, and he was burned so bad he died when the boat got knocked out of the fight. Us boys didn't do much fighting at Fort Henry, but at Donelson, I can tell you we made up for it. We had done a foolish thing on our way to Donelson, and I will write you about it. When we was marching toward the fort, the weather was like a hot April day back home. We was feeling set up about Fort Henry, and when some of the boys got tired of carrying heavy blanket rolls, they just up and throwed them away. Then more and more of us acted like crazy fools, and we throwed away heavy coats and things to make our loads a little lighter. As soon as we got to Donelson, the weather turned cold. As Billy sideways and some of the boys was sick or bad hurt, they froze to death in the snow. Things was awful bad with so many killed and others froze. I felt sick when I looked at them, and so I am not so proud about Donelson as maybe I ought to be. I miss your good cooking, Ma. You tell Jet that being a soldier ain't so much. Yours truly, Tom. So make sure you go back through that letter. If you need to rewind this and have me read it again so that you can understand what he's saying, please make sure that you do that so that you can figure out what is it in his letter, what are pick out the main points that he has written about to tell Mom. So there's 2 battles, and then what does he say at the end? So I would ask you to have at least 3 points within there, okay? Jethro noticed that his mother's face was strangely twisted when he looked up from the letter. There was a look about her as if sorrow had been frozen in her face, a look he had not seen there before, not even on the day when he had come home from Walnut Hill to tell her that Bill had left. She stared at Jethro for a time without saying a word, then she got up and went into the pantry, closing the door behind her. Jethro sat quietly beside the fireplace. There was no sound in the cabin except the crackling of the fire, and there was no feeling inside him except a great loneliness. He picked up Tom's letter and read it again. Then he smoothed it carefully and returned it to the envelope. It seemed strange that this scrap of paper had actually come from a battlefield, that Tom's big hand had actually touched it. He tried to imagine what the ironclads looked like and how they had taken Fort Henry, how the guns must have roared in Donelson. Whatever in the world had possessed Tom and the other soldiers when they threw away good winter coats and blankets? The pantry door opened after a while, and his mother came back into the kitchen. Your ma's no company for you this afternoon, son. That's no matter, Ma. Maybe it would be good for you to go down and visit Shad for a while, she suggested after a pause. You need a mite of a change. He turned to her eagerly. Could I, Ma? He asked, half in disbelief that he had understood her. I want him to read Tom's letter, she said, taking up the envelope. Maybe after Pa and Jenny has seen it, you could take it on to Shad. Sure, Ma, I'd be proud to do it for you. To remind you that there was a question about, actually I'm gonna just go back and peek at it so I get the wording correctly. Why did Jethro go to Shad's house? And actually I think these are kind of out of order because we didn't get the information about Jenny yet. But we did get 2 answers here about why Jethro was going to go down to Shad's house. So if we kind of peek back, you can think the first one right here, she says she wants him to read Tom's letter, but she makes another comment here. Your ma is no company for you this afternoon. She's quite sad and upset about what she's just read in that letter. So she just wants to be alone. Sure, Ma, I'd be proud to do it for you. Ellen smiled wanly at his eagerness. It's terrible cold, but I reckon you could stay the night with him if he's a mind to ask you. Then you'd have only one way to walk. You're doing me a real big favor, Miss Crichton. I allowed it would be, Jeff. Well, you and Shad have a good visit tonight. Ask him to come here for supper tomorrow. Him and little Jenny ain't got many more evenings to be together. The prospect of a visit with Shadrach changed the color of the world around Jeff, and he rushed to get his chores done early. He stacked a high pile of wood outside the kitchen where it could be reached quickly during the night. Out in the barn, he threw hay down from the loft and carried buckets of corn from the crib in preparation for the evening feeding of the stock. He was still working when Jenny came out to find him shortly after she and Father returned from their work. He noticed that her eyes were heavy with tears. You read Tom's letter? He asked. She sat down on a mound of hay and the tears started again. Jethro stood beside her without speaking. After a while, she looked up at him. Ma says you're going to go up to Shad's tonight. Ma's having him here for supper tomorrow night so as you can and him can talk some, he said, recognizing the envy in her look. Ma understands. She'd let me marry Shad before he leaves, but Pa won't. He talked to me about it this afternoon. It's the same old story. You're too young to be married, Jenny. You're just a little girl. Oh, Jeff, it's horrible to be so young. Why does there have to be a war to take Shad away from me before I'm of an age that Pa thinks I'm old enough for marrying? What is it about war that's got Jenny so upset? There's your answer right there. Jethro was sympathetic and terribly uncomfortable. He shifted from one foot to the other and touched her shoulder timidly. She put her hand over his for an instant and then got to her feet. I reckon I got precious little right to be crying over my troubles. He knew she was thinking of Tom, away somewhere in Kentucky or Tennessee with Grant's army. They didn't speak again until they were nearly up to the kitchen door. I'll help you get bundled up for your trip, she said then, and added hurriedly, remember to tell me everything he says, Jeff. Will you do that for me? I sure will, he answered soberly. There was a time when he would have teased her, but not that evening. There was no time for light-hearted teasing about Shadrach Yale now that the winter term of school was over. Indeed, inside the house, she helped him pull on 2 pairs of heavy knitted socks, which helped to fill out the pair of Tom's old shoes he was wearing, and she buttoned a heavy sheepskin coat around him, tying the collar up around his ears with her own red woolen scarf. Ellen drew a flat loaf of white bread from the ashes of the fireplace and wrapped it in a clean cloth. This will keep your hands warm for a part of the way, at least. It ain't much of a gift to carry, but maybe the 2 of you will relish a little change from the cornbread. He was patient. He knew that after a while they would let him go. There might be another adjustment of his collar, another gift for Shad, more admonitions about his company manners. I'm not sure if we had admonitions on our vocab list yet for this round, but we did have it on our giver list. If you remember that admonitions is kind of like a reprimand or another rule, okay? But finally, they would let him go. And they did, finally. He had to have his coat unbuttoned at the last minute and Tom's letter pinned securely inside his shirt. But after that, there seemed to be no other reason for detaining him. Nothing to do but stand at the window watching as he plunged out into the cold late afternoon for his visit. The deep ruts in the road were frozen and glazed with ice. The wind had a clean sweep across the prairies, a sweep that sometimes seemed about to carry Jethro before it. Tears froze on his cheeks, and the cold pounded against his forehead as he trudged along, weighted by the heavy, oversized shoes and the many layers of clothing. It was bitter, but not beyond the ordinary suffering at the mercy of the elements was accepted by Jethro as being quite as natural as the hunger from green vegetables and fresh fruit that was always with him during the winter. When one found comfort, he was grateful. But he was never such a fool as to expect a great deal of it. The hardships one endured had a purpose. His mother had been careful to make him aware of that. The schoolhouse with the teacher's log room adjoining it stood almost a mile from the Creighton cabin. It had been customary in years past for the schoolmaster to room and board with first one family and then another throughout the district. But young Yale had protested against the lack of privacy, and Matthew Creighton had been sympathetic. A man has a right to the dignity of his own fireplace after a day's work, he said. and he had allowed his sons and Shadrach to cut down trees from his own land for the annex. Shadrach Yale put down an armful of wood when he saw his guest approaching and came out to the road to meet him. "You look half frozen, Jeth," he said, and taking the boy's hand, ran with him up to the log annex. "Come on inside, I'll have you thawed out in a minute or two." Shadrach's long, narrow room was cheerful and attractive in spite of his roughness. A bright red and gold paisley cloth covered his homemade table and fell in full folds almost to the floor. There were a few braided rugs of warmly colored woolen scattered about, and on the mantel of the fireplace were candlesticks of heavy brass worn to a smooth satin finish. Opposite the fireplace were shelves made of logs split in half and nailed against the wall to hold the books which Shadrach had brought with him from college. The guitar hung on the wall at the south end of the room, and at that end, too, there was a wide bed made up with several comforters which Ellen had loaned him from her own store of bedding. A cupboard of heavy walnut put together with wooden pegs stood near the fireplace and held dishes, food, and cooking utensils. To Jethro, the room seemed perfect, as beautiful as any man had a right to expect. Shadrach helped him out of the sheepskin coat and put him in the armchair in front of the fireplace, where the flames struck a great log and shot up in the hot tongues now and then, as the fat from the roasting chicken dripped into the fire. The warmth, the smell of food and wood smoke overpowered Jethro for a while, and he would have sat silent, drinking and content if his obligations as a guest had not demanded more of him. "Going to spend the night with me, Jeth?" Shadrach asked, removing the boy's heavy shoes and chafing his feet with cheerful vigor. "Ma allowed I could if you was of a mind to ask me." "I think she knew pretty well that I'd be of a mind to ask you. She sent that loaf of white bread for our supper. It's fresh out of the ashes." "Good. I'm glad now I had the sense to start a chicken roasting. Fresh bread and chicken should make a pretty good meal for a couple of hungry bachelors like us, eh?" Jethro flushed with pleasure. Shad was like that. He was different. He had book learning and was almost 21. Still, he could make a 10-year-old schoolboy feel as proud as a man. "How's Jenny?" Shadrach asked after a time. "She was crying a little. Pa's been talking to her about being too young for Mary and me, I know." It was the schoolmaster's turn to flush, and he looked stern, as he did sometimes in the classroom. "Ma would let her get married to you, Shad, but sometimes Pa can be so good, and then again he can be awful strict." Shadrach stared gloomily at Jethro's foot, which he still held in his hands. "I respect him so much," he said after a while, "and I owe him so much. But I think he's overshooting the mark when he sets himself up knowing exactly what is right or wrong for two other people. I think he's being tyrannical and—" He stopped himself abruptly. Tyrannical will be another one of our vocabulary words you'll be looking at soon. Like a tyrant. Someone who's a tyrant would be tyrannical. Jethro felt a twinge of loyalty for his father in the face of Shadrach's obvious anger. "Of course, Jenny is real young, Shad," he said with the gravity of a small person. Shadrach raised a black eyebrow. "Thou too, Brutus?" he asked, grinning a little sourly. Jethro didn't understand the allusion, and Shadrach seemed to be in no mood for explanations. Any of you know that allusion? "Thou too, Brutus?" You ever heard of Julius Caesar? And they're all stabbing him in the back. His best friend Brutus turns on him too. "Okay. There wouldn't be any question about it if it weren't for this war," he said after a moment with his own thoughts. "I'd be willing to wait years for Jenny. But when I think of leaving her, maybe for a long time, I guess panic hits me a little." "When do you go, Shad?" "Next week. John and I. He'll go as far as Chicago with me. I'll go back to Philadelphia." "Seems like I can't face up to your going." "I'm not eager for it either, Jeth, not by a long way. I've got a lot of plans for the next 40 or 50 years of my life, and being a soldier is not a part of any single one of them." "Do you have to do it then?" "I guess I do. There's been a long chain of events leading up to this time. The dreams of men in my generation are as insignificant as that." He snapped his fingers sharply. "We were foolish enough to reach manhood just when the long fizzling turned into an explosion." I think I'm going to pause our lesson here. Although, yes, there is more than I thought so. I know that with this particular chapter, I usually don't get through the whole thing in one whole class period. So I'm going to stop here because it kind of gets to a point where it feels like it's dragging out. I don't know if you feel that way, but we're approaching half an hour on the lesson time, and I really don't want to push it too much over that for a day. So what I would like you to do for the rest of today is to go back and do the questions that were in there. I do know that I'm going to be sharing more vocabulary at another time. I'm not sure if I'm putting that in this week as far as today or another day. It'll be in there soon, and it'll be in your weekly to-dos. So make sure that you check when I'm recommending that you work on the vocabulary. Other than that, I will see you tomorrow for us to finish this chapter, and have a great rest of your day. I hope you get outside. Hope it's nice on the day you're watching this.